On April 7, 1945, the largest battleship ever built steamed through the East China Sea towards certain death. Yamato displaced 70,000 tons and carried 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells the weight of a car over 25 miles. Her armor reached 16 inches in places, leading some American officers to believe she might be unsinkable. Yet that morning she was not hunting warships or supporting carriers. She was on a one-way mission with just enough fuel to reach Okinawa, none to return. Orders demanded she beach herself, fire inland until her magazines were empty, and fight to the last man. 3,000 sailors, many barely out of their teens, knew they were sailing to their graves. What Japanese command ignored was that the Americans were ready with overwhelming air power. Nearly 400 aircraft from 11 carriers of Task Force 58 were hunting her. Yamato was about to confront a reality her designers had never anticipated. The battleship era was over, and naval aviation had claimed supremacy with finality. If stories like Yamato's doomed final voyage fascinate you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so history's most powerful lessons never fade. In 1934, during a period when the world was still recovering from the economic devastation of the Great Depression and trying desperately to avoid another catastrophic global war, the major naval powers gathered in London to sign what became known as the Second London Naval Treaty. This international agreement placed very strict limits on the size, displacement, and firepower of battleships that any signatory nation could legally build. The treaty specifically capped battleship main battery guns at 14 inches in diameter and established displacement limits that were carefully designed to prevent another ruinously expensive naval arms race, like the one that had preceded World War I and nearly bankrupted several European nations. But Japan, which had initially signed the treaty along with Britain and the United States, had very different long-term plans that directly contradicted the spirit of international cooperation. The Imperial Japanese Navy leadership, particularly the influential battleship faction within the naval staff, firmly believed that they were inevitably destined for a major military confrontation with the United States Navy at some point in the future. They understood with absolute clarity that America's massive industrial capacity and natural resources meant that Japan could never hope to match the United States in a straightforward ship-for-ship naval building competition based purely on quantity. The solution that emerged from the strategic planning sessions was both mathematically elegant and strategically terrifying in its implications. If Japan could not build more ships than America, then Japan would instead build individual ships that were so incredibly powerful, so heavily armed and armored, that a single Japanese battleship could theoretically engage and defeat 2 or possibly even 3 American battleships simultaneously in combat. On November 4th, 1937, construction officially began in conditions of absolute and unprecedented secrecy at the Kure Naval Arsenal, one of Japan's largest and most sophisticated shipbuilding facilities. The entire massive shipyard where the Yamato was being constructed was completely covered with enormous tarps and surrounded by tall rope curtains, specifically designed to prevent foreign intelligence operatives or aerial reconnaissance from catching even a glimpse of what was actually being built inside those protective barriers. Workers who were employed on the project were explicitly forbidden from discussing any details whatsoever about their work, even in the most general terms with their own family members or closest friends. American naval intelligence officers knew that the Japanese were building something significantly larger than treaty limits allowed, but they genuinely had no accurate idea just how absolutely massive and powerful the Yamato truly was until it was far too late in the war for that knowledge to meaningfully matter. The raw numbers and specifications alone were absolutely staggering to anyone with even basic knowledge of naval architecture and battleship design. The Yamato stretched an incredible 863 feet from her bow to her stern, which made her physically longer than 3 American football fields placed end to end in a straight line. She displaced over 72,000 tons when fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, supplies, and crew, which made her significantly heavier and more massive than any battleship that the Americans or British currently had in active service anywhere in the world. But the truly revolutionary and unprecedented feature was her main battery armament, consisting of 9 enormous 18.1-inch naval rifles, which were quite simply the largest naval guns ever successfully mounted and fired on any warship in human history. Each of those massive armor-piercing shells weighed an incredible 3,200 pounds when fully loaded and ready to fire, which was roughly equivalent to the total weight of a Honda Civic automobile. These shells could be fired with sufficient force and accuracy to penetrate through the thick deck armor of virtually any ship currently afloat anywhere in the world at engagement ranges exceeding 25 miles. Which was far beyond the effective range of most other battleship main batteries of that era. The theoretical killing power and destructive potential that these guns represented was absolutely unprecedented in the entire history of naval warfare up to that point. The armor protection system was equally impressive in its scale and sophistication, and it consumed an absolutely massive portion of the ship's total weight budget. The Yamato's main vertical belt armor, which protected her vital machinery spaces and magazines from enemy shell fire, reached an incredible thickness of 16 inches in the most critical areas around her machinery and ammunition storage spaces. Her horizontal deck armor, which was specifically designed to protect against bombs dropped from high-altitude aircraft or plunging fire from enemy battleships at extreme ranges, was layered in multiple thick plates. The designers believed they had built an unsinkable fortress, and on August 8, 1940, after nearly 3 years of work and enormous use of scarce materials, Yamato was launched in a grand ceremony attended by military leaders and members of the imperial family. Even then, her true specifications remained secret, with official documents falsely listing her displacement at 45,000 tons to suggest treaty compliance. Yet beneath the engineering brilliance lay a fatal flaw. By the time Yamato was completed and commissioned in December 1941, naval warfare had already shifted toward aircraft carriers, whose planes could strike hundreds of miles away, far beyond the reach of battleship guns. Yamato represented the peak of battleship design but was already obsolete, and thousands of sailors would pay the price for this miscalculation. Japan had poured immense resources into what it thought was the ultimate weapon, but in reality, it was the wrong weapon for the war ahead. A masterpiece of outdated naval thinking built with modern technology. And that mismatch would prove devastating. If you're finding this deep dive into naval history as fascinating as we do, take just a second to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It genuinely helps us create more detailed documentaries like this one, and we have so many more incredible naval stories to share with you. December 7th, 1941. A date that President Franklin Roosevelt would famously declare would live in infamy. The Japanese surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii brought the United States directly into World War II, and initiated what would become the largest and most destructive naval conflict in all of human history. The Imperial Japanese Navy had just achieved one of the most stunning and successful tactical surprise attacks ever recorded in military history, successfully crippling a significant portion of the American Pacific Fleet's battleship force in a single devastating morning of coordinated aerial attacks. But the Yamato, which was supposed to be Japan's most powerful and capable weapon, the ultimate expression of Japanese naval might, was nowhere near Pearl Harbor during this historic attack. While Japanese aircraft carriers were successfully launching the waves of attack planes that would fundamentally change the course of the entire war and bring America into the global conflict, the Yamato was still back in Japanese home waters conducting routine sea trials and working through various mechanical issues and technical problems that are completely normal for any new warship. She would not be officially commissioned into active service with the Imperial Japanese Navy until December 16, 1941, which was more than a full week after the Pearl Harbor attack had already occurred. Her very first official assignment after commissioning was to serve as the prestigious flagship of the combined fleet, which sounds extremely important but in practice mostly involved staying safely anchored in protected harbors far away from any actual combat operations where she might be at risk. In early June 1942, barely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Yamato finally participated in her first major fleet operation during the Battle of Midway, which military historians now recognize as the definitive turning point of the entire Pacific War. This battle would see the Japanese Navy lose 4 fleet aircraft carriers in a single day, fundamentally shifting the balance of naval power in the Pacific in favor of the United States. But even during this absolutely crucial and historically significant engagement, where Japan's entire strategic position in the Pacific was at stake, the mighty Yamato never once fired her massive main battery guns in anger at an enemy target. She was deliberately positioned far behind the main carrier strike force as part of the distant covering force. And when American dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet successfully located and devastated the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the Yamato was simply too far away from the actual fighting to provide any meaningful assistance or support whatsoever. The exact same frustrating pattern repeated itself again and again throughout the remainder of 1942 and continuing well into 1943. The Yamato would receive orders to sortie out with the fleet. She would consume absolutely enormous quantities of increasingly scarce and strategically vital fuel oil. Just to move her massive bulk through the water, she would sail around the Pacific looking impressively, intimidating to anyone who saw her, and then she would dutifully return to port without ever actually engaging any enemy surface ships in the kind of dramatic gun duel that she had been specifically designed to win. Her increasingly frustrated crew members began sarcastically calling her the Yamato Hotel because she seemed to spend vastly more time safely anchored in protected harbors than she spent actually fighting the war, while smaller destroyers and cruisers were constantly at sea doing the actual dangerous fighting. There was actually a very practical and understandable reason for this extremely cautious deployment strategy that kept the Yamato away from combat. The senior officers in Japanese Naval Command clearly understood that the Yamato represented an absolutely enormous investment of limited national resources, scarce industrial capacity, and tremendous national prestige. Losing her in combat, especially early in the war when Japanese morale was still relatively high, would represent a psychological and propaganda catastrophe for Japan that would be extremely difficult to recover from. Therefore, they made the conscious decision to keep her carefully in reserve, saving her for the great, decisive battle that traditional Japanese naval doctrine had always promised would eventually come and settle the war in one massive surface engagement. The fundamental problem with this strategy was that the decisive battle, at least in the form that Japanese naval planners had envisioned it since the early 1900s, simply never materialized in the way they had confidently imagined it would. As 1943 gradually transitioned into 1944, the overall strategic situation in the vast Pacific theater deteriorated with increasing rapidity for Japan. American forces, now fully mobilized and producing war materials at an absolutely staggering rate that Japan could never hope to match, were steadily advancing westward across the Pacific in a brutal and methodical island hopping campaign that bypassed heavily defended Japanese strongpoints and seized key strategic locations. Japanese naval power, which had seemed so dominant immediately after Pearl Harbor, was being steadily whittled away through a grinding series of carrier battles and submarine attacks where the Americans increasingly dominated both the skies and the seas. Throughout this entire period of steady Japanese decline, the Yamato remained largely inactive and safely tucked away in harbor, a powerful symbol of might that was never actually exercised in any meaningful way. In June 1944, during what became known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Yamato finally had yet another significant opportunity to potentially prove her worth in actual combat operations. The Japanese Navy assembled a large carrier strike force in a desperate attempt to halt the American advance toward the Mariana Islands, which were critically important to Japan's defense perimeter. But once again, despite the Yamato's presence with the fleet, American carrier aircraft struck first and absolutely devastated the Japanese carrier force in what American pilots would later mockingly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of how easily they shot down inexperienced Japanese pilots. The Yamato survived this particular battle completely unscathed, primarily because American pilots were far too busy methodically destroying Japanese carriers and shooting down Japanese aircraft to worry very much about attacking heavily armored battleships that posed relatively little threat to them. By October 1944, Japan's overall strategic situation had deteriorated from merely bad to absolutely desperate. American forces were actively preparing to invade the Philippines, which was a completely unacceptable development from Japan's perspective, because losing the Philippines would effectively cut Japan off completely from accessing the critical oil supplies and other natural resources of Southeast Asia that were absolutely essential to keeping the Japanese war machine operational. The Japanese Naval Command, faced with this existential crisis, made the fateful decision to commit virtually everything they had left in terms of naval forces in one last desperate all-or-nothing effort to disrupt and hopefully destroy the American landing forces. Finally, after spending nearly 3 full years of global war sitting safely in harbor or conducting meaningless patrols, the Yamato was actually going to get her long-awaited chance to prove her value in real combat. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in late October 1944 became the largest naval battle in history, involving hundreds of ships across multiple engagements in the Philippine Sea. Japan's plan called for 3 separate forces to converge on the American landing zones, with Yamato assigned to Vice Admiral Kurita's central force alongside Musashi, other battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. As they moved through the San Bernardino Strait on October 24th, they were relentlessly attacked by American submarines and carrier aircraft. Musashi absorbed wave after wave of bombs and torpedoes before capsizing and sinking with most of her crew, while Yamato survived with only minor damage. The next morning, Kurita's force unexpectedly encountered small American escort carriers and destroyers, a situation seemingly perfect for Yamato's massive guns. She opened fire for the only time in her career against enemy warships, but the Americans fought with extraordinary courage, laying smoke screens, launching desperate torpedo attacks, and sending every available plane into the fight. After 2 hours of chaos, Kurita suddenly ordered a retreat, fearing he faced a larger force and possible trap. Yamato damaged one carrier and helped sink another, but far short of the decisive victory envisioned. Leyte Gulf was a catastrophic defeat for Japan, costing them carriers, battleships including Musashi, cruisers, destroyers, and thousands of sailors, while ending any hope of holding the Philippines and securing vital resources. Yamato returned to Japan, where fuel shortages and the collapsing war effort kept her tied to port for months. By early 1945, Japan was quite literally losing the war in every single measurable way that military strategists used to assess their position. American B-29 Superfortress bombers were systematically and methodically destroying Japanese cities through massive incendiary bombing raids that created horrific firestorms, killing tens of thousands of civilians. The critical fuel shortages had progressed from merely serious to absolutely catastrophic, with virtually no oil available for training pilots or conducting regular naval operations. American military forces were steadily and inexorably advancing ever closer toward the Japanese home islands themselves, and everyone from the highest-ranking generals down to ordinary civilians understood that the final invasion of Japan was inevitable, unless something dramatically changed. In April 1945, American forces launched a massive invasion of Okinawa, a large and strategically vital island located just 300 340 miles south of the Japanese mainland, and it was absolutely clear to everyone that this would be the last major battle before American forces attempted a direct invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves. The Japanese army was fighting with absolute desperation on Okinawa in what would eventually become one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the entire Pacific War, resulting in casualties that numbered in the tens of thousands on both sides. But the Japanese Navy, which had once dominated the entire Pacific Ocean and struck fear into the hearts of its enemies, had essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force capable of influencing major battles. Most of their ships had already been sunk in previous battles, and those few ships that remained operational were trapped uselessly in port without sufficient fuel to conduct meaningful operations. The Americans had achieved complete and total control of both the air and the sea around Okinawa, and absolutely everyone in both the American and Japanese high commands knew this fundamental fact perfectly well. In early April, the Imperial Japanese Navy staff officers in Tokyo held a series of increasingly desperate and contentious meetings to discuss what, if anything at all, they could possibly do to support the defense of Okinawa and demonstrate that the Navy still had some role to play in Japan's defense. The Yamato was still technically afloat and mostly operational from a mechanical standpoint, but she was also effectively trapped like a caged animal. There simply wasn't enough fuel oil available to conduct any normal naval operations, and sailing anywhere into contested waters would mean inevitably exposing the ship to overwhelming American air power, without any realistic hope of receiving air cover or fighter protection from the few remaining Japanese aircraft, which were being carefully hoarded for kamikaze suicide attacks. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, an experienced and respected officer who commanded the Second Fleet, which included the Yamato, understood the overall military situation with brutal and unflinching clarity. When he was first presented with the rough outline of the operational plan that would eventually be refined and designated as Operation Tengo, he reportedly told his assembled staff officers quite bluntly that this mission was absolutely tantamount to suicide and served no legitimate or useful military purpose whatsoever. His assessment was completely and absolutely correct from any rational military perspective, but the final decision about whether or not to execute this mission was no longer being made based on sound military logic or rational strategic calculations. The plan that gradually emerged from these contentious meetings and heated debates reflected a uniquely Japanese cultural logic, centered around concepts of honor, duty, and meaningful death that Western military observers often genuinely struggled to understand or explain to their own people. The deeply embedded cultural concept of dying with honor, of deliberately choosing a meaningful and purposeful death over a meaningless survival or shameful surrender, ran incredibly deep in the Japanese military tradition stretching back centuries. If the Yamato was inevitably going to be destroyed anyway, and everyone with any strategic sense understood intellectually that she would be destroyed sooner or later, given Japan's deteriorating position, then at least her destruction could serve some powerful symbolic purpose and demonstrate to the world that Japan still possessed the will to fight, rather than meekly accepting defeat. The final operational orders that were drafted and approved were straightforward in their objectives and absolutely terrifying in their implications for everyone who would be required to carry them out. The Yamato, escorted by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, would sortie from the protected waters of the inland sea and steam southward toward Okinawa through waters that were completely dominated by American naval and air forces. They would be given just barely enough fuel to reach Okinawa, but not nearly enough fuel to make the return journey back to Japan, which made the one-way nature of this mission absolutely explicit and undeniable. Once the force arrived off the coast of Okinawa, assuming they somehow survived the journey, the Yamato was supposed to deliberately beach herself on the shoreline like a dying whale, turn her massive main battery guns inland toward the American invasion forces, and fight as a stationary artillery battery supporting the Japanese army troops defending the island until her ammunition was completely exhausted and the ship itself was destroyed by American counterattacks. The crews of these ships, thousands of young men who had joined the Navy with dreams of serving their country with honor, were explicitly ordered to fight until they were killed. And then any survivors who somehow managed to make it ashore alive were expected to continue fighting as infantry soldiers until they too were eventually killed. There was absolutely no provision whatsoever in the operational plan for any kind of retreat if things went badly, no extraction plan if the mission became obviously hopeless, and no realistic possibility of survival for anyone who participated. This was a suicide mission in the most brutally literal sense of that term, though it was carefully dressed up in the elaborate and flowery language of honorable sacrifice, glorious death, and sacred duty to the Emperor. When Vice Admiral Ito solemnly briefed his senior officers on the specific details of this mission, several of them openly and directly questioned whether this plan made any kind of strategic or tactical sense from a military perspective. One particularly brave staff officer stood up and directly pointed out that sending the Yamato on what amounted to a suicide mission wouldn't actually help the desperate defense of Okinawa in any meaningful or practical way, and would simply result in the pointless waste of the lives of approximately 3,000 sailors sailors who could potentially be used more effectively elsewhere. Admiral Ito quietly agreed with this assessment, but then patiently explained that the final decision had already been made at the highest levels of the Naval Command and the government, and therefore their duty as professional officers was simply to carry out their orders to the best of their ability, regardless of their personal feelings about those orders. On April 6, 1945, under gray and threatening skies that seemed to match the somber mood, the Yamato and her small escort force made their final preparations to sortie from port on what everyone aboard knew was a one-way mission to their deaths: the atmosphere. Throughout the ship was extraordinarily strange and deeply somber, completely unlike the usual pre-battle excitement and nervous energy. Many of the sailors had been granted brief shore leave the previous day to visit their families and say their final goodbyes, though they were strictly forbidden from explaining exactly where they were going or why they were saying goodbye. Some of the younger sailors wrote long and emotional final letters to their parents and sweethearts back home. Others performed small personal rituals to mentally prepare themselves for their impending deaths according to their religious or cultural beliefs. The crew of the Yamato at the time of her final sortie numbered approximately 2,750 officers and enlisted men of all ranks and specialties. The vast majority of them were extremely young men, with many barely out of their teenage years, and some who looked like they should still be in school. They had originally joined the Imperial Japanese Navy with excitement and pride, expecting to serve aboard the most powerful and prestigious warship in the entire world. And instead, they now found themselves methodically preparing for a mission that absolutely everyone aboard understood was nothing more than elaborate and ritualized suicide. But the powerful Japanese military culture of absolute obedience to superior officers and the deeply embedded cultural concept of honorable death in service to the emperor meant that open rebellion, mutiny, or refusal to follow orders was simply completely unthinkable for these young men, no matter how much they might have privately disagreed with the mission. At exactly 4 p.m. on the afternoon of April 6, 1945, the small fleet consisting of the battleship Yamato, light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers slowly departed from their anchorage at Tokuyama in the inland sea and began their final journey toward Okinawa and certain death. The weather conditions were overcast and threatening, with heavy clouds hanging low over the water, which the Japanese commanders desperately hoped might provide at least some minimal concealment from American reconnaissance aircraft that were constantly searching for Japanese naval movements. The Yamato led the formation in single file, her absolutely massive bulk cutting smoothly through the choppy seas as she headed southwest toward the Bungo Strait that would take them out of the relatively protected inland sea and into the open Pacific Ocean where American forces were waiting. But the Americans already knew with complete certainty that the Japanese were coming and had known for hours. Multiple American submarines that had been specifically positioned along likely Japanese exit routes from the inland sea spotted the Japanese formation almost immediately after it departed from port, and within just a few hours, Admiral Raymond Spruance, who was commanding the massive Fifth Fleet that was supporting the Okinawa invasion, had been fully informed that the Yamato was at sea and heading in their direction. Admiral Spruance, an experienced and capable officer who had commanded American forces at the Battle of Midway, immediately began planning exactly how he would destroy the Yamato, and he had absolutely overwhelming force readily available to accomplish that mission with relative ease. Task Force 58, which was the powerful fast carrier task force that was providing direct air support for the Okinawa invasion, included an impressive total of 11 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, with approximately 400 strike aircraft of various types immediately available for combat operations. The massive fleet carriers, Hornet, Bennington, Essex, Bunker Hill, Hancock, Intrepid, and Yorktown, along with several smaller light carriers, began launching long-range search planes throughout the evening of April 6th, systematically searching the likely approach routes to Okinawa for any sign of the Japanese force that they knew was coming. Throughout the long, intense night of April 6th, the Yamato and her escorts steamed steadily southward through increasingly rough seas, with waves crashing over the bows of the smaller destroyers. Admiral Ito stood on the bridge of the Yamato staring out into the darkness, knowing with absolute certainty that American submarines were shadowing his force in the darkness and continuously reporting his exact position, course, and speed back to the American fleet. He knew without any doubt that at first light the next morning, massive waves of American carrier planes would come to destroy his ships. There was no surprise available, no clever tactical maneuver that would save them from their fate, no possible way to avoid what was coming. They were simply sailing deliberately and methodically toward their own destruction, moving forward as steadily and inevitably as condemned men walking slowly and purposefully to the gallows. Dawn finally broke on April 7, 1945, revealing cloudy skies and rough, seas with whitecaps visible in every direction. At 8:23 a.m. on April 7, 1945, American reconnaissance planes spotted the Japanese formation north of Okinawa, exactly as predicted. The report was relayed to Task Force 58, and Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered a massive strike using every available aircraft. Between 10 a.m. and 12:30 p.m., nearly 400 planes, Avenger torpedo bombers, Helldiver dive bombers, and Hellcat fighters launched in coordinated waves against the Japanese ships, which had no air cover. At 12:30 p.m., Yamato's lookouts sighted the incoming aircraft, and the ship went to battle stations. Every anti-aircraft gun manned. The American pilots had been briefed to focus torpedo attacks on Yamato's port side to induce flooding and capsize her. At 12:45 p.m., the first torpedoes struck, shaking the ship violently. Damage control fought desperately, but within 30 minutes she had taken at least 8 torpedo hits, most on her port side, and began listing heavily. Counter-flooding failed, and by shortly after 2 p.m., she was listing more than 30 degrees, clearly doomed. Admiral Ito ordered the crew to abandon ship, though he and Captain Aruga remained aboard with senior officers. At 2:23 p.m., Yamato rolled over and her forward magazines exploded in a massive detonation that sent a mushroom cloud 20,000 feet into the sky. Of 2,750 crew, only 269 survived. Most perished in the sinking or in the water. Admiral Ito, Captain Aruga, and nearly all senior officers died with the ship. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers were also sunk, bringing Japanese losses in Operation Tengo to over 3,700 men. The Americans lost only 10 aircraft and 12 aircrew, making the battle one of the most lopsided naval victories in history, and the final proof of the battleship's obsolescence in modern warfare. Would you like me to also create a very short epitaph-style version? Just a few sentences that capture Yamato's end as both tragedy and symbol? The shattered wreck of the Yamato lies today in approximately 1,100 feet of cold, dark water about 180 miles southwest of the southern tip of Kyushu. She broke apart into 3 main large sections when she exploded and sank, and these massive sections are now scattered across the ocean floor in an extensive debris field that silently tells the violent story of her final moments. The enormous gun turrets, each one weighing thousands of tons even without their guns, lie separated from the main hull sections where they fell away when the ship rolled over and capsized. In the many decades since the war ended, several well-funded underwater expeditions have carefully explored the wreck site using sophisticated remotely operated vehicles, equipped with high-definition cameras and advanced sonar imaging systems. These systematic explorations have conclusively revealed the incredible extent of the catastrophic damage that the ship sustained during her final desperate battle. The multiple torpedo hits that ultimately doomed the Yamato are clearly visible today, as massive jagged tears and holes in her portside hull plating that allowed thousands of tons of seawater to flood into her interior spaces. Naval architects and marine engineers who have carefully studied both the physical wreck and the detailed battle reports from both American and Japanese sources have determined that the Yamato was actually an incredibly tough and resilient ship that withstood far more punishment than most other battleships of her era could possibly have survived. The fundamental problem was not that she was somehow poorly designed or weakly constructed. The real problem was that she had been specifically designed and optimized to survive and fight through shellfire from enemy battleships in traditional surface gun battles. But she was not and could not have been adequately designed to survive massed aerial torpedo attacks from hundreds of coordinated aircraft attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. To put the Yamato's impressive size and theoretical combat power into proper perspective for modern viewers, it's useful to directly compare her specifications with those of her primary American counterparts, the Iowa-class battleships. A typical Iowa-class ship displaced approximately 57,000 tons at full combat load compared to the Yamato's much heavier 72,000 tons. The Iowa's main battery armament consisted of 9 16-inch guns compared to the Yamato's larger 18.1-inch guns. Based purely on these paper specifications, the Yamato clearly had a significant theoretical advantage in both armor protection and raw firepower in any hypothetical one-on-one surface engagement. However, the Iowa-class ships possessed several crucial advantages that ultimately proved far more important in actual World War II combat conditions. They were significantly faster ships, with a maximum speed of approximately 33 knots compared to the Yamato's more modest 27 knots, which gave them much better tactical flexibility. They had substantially better radar systems and fire control systems, which meant they could locate, track, and accurately engage targets much more effectively, especially at night or in poor weather conditions. And perhaps most importantly, they were designed from the very beginning of their design process to operate effectively as part of a combined arms team with aircraft carriers, providing essential air cover and long-range reconnaissance rather than operating as independent units. The fundamental lesson of Operation Tengo and the Yamato's destruction was brutally clear and undeniable. Battleships, regardless of how powerful, heavily armed, or well-armored they might be, simply could not survive in any combat environment where the enemy possessed air superiority. The ability of aircraft to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, to strike vulnerable areas below the waterline with torpedoes, and to continue attacking in successive waves until the target was destroyed, made even the most heavily armored battleship extremely vulnerable and ultimately doomed. This was not uniquely a Japanese problem or a unique flaw in Japanese naval design philosophy. The British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse had both been sunk by Japanese land-based torpedo bombers early in the war. The German battleship Bismarck had been crippled by British carrier aircraft and then finished off by surface ships. American battleships including Arizona, Oklahoma, California, and West Virginia had been destroyed or very heavily damaged by Japanese carrier aircraft during the Pearl Harbor attack. But the Yamato's destruction was particularly dramatic and historically significant because she represented the absolute peak of battleship design, and her complete failure and destruction marked the definitive and undeniable end of the battleship era in naval warfare. Approximately 4 months after the Yamato sank, taking most of her crew with her to the bottom, Japan formally surrendered to the Allied powers, finally ending World War II. In the difficult years that followed, the Japanese people were forced to reckon with and come to terms with the enormous cost of the war, in terms of lives lost, cities destroyed, and national treasure wasted. The story of the Yamato gradually became a powerful symbol of both the incredible courage of ordinary Japanese sailors and the tragic futility that characterized so much of Japan's overall war effort. In Japan today, the Yamato occupies an extremely complex and somewhat controversial place in the national collective memory and historical consciousness. There is a large and impressive museum dedicated specifically to the ship and her crew in the city of Kure, the same city where she was originally built. And this museum draws hundreds of thousands of visitors every single year from all over Japan and around the world. The carefully designed exhibits walk a very careful and deliberate line between appropriately honoring the personal courage and sacrifice of the young men who served on the ship and died in Operation Tengo, while also honestly acknowledging the larger tragedy of their deaths in a mission that served absolutely no legitimate military purpose. The museum displays various artifacts that have been carefully recovered from the wreck site over the years, incredibly detailed scale models that demonstrate the sheer size of the ship, and personal items and photographs belonging to individual crew members who died during Operation Tengo. The Yamato Memorial is a powerful and emotional place that honors the men who served aboard the battleship while prompting reflection on war, nationalism, sacrifice, and the human cost of conflict. Survivors who lived long enough shared vivid accounts of terror, desperate rescue attempts, and lifelong survivors' guilt. Strategically, Yamato's destruction marked the end of the battleship era and the rise of aircraft carriers as the dominant capital ships, a shift every navy embraced after World War II. In the decades since, naval warfare has evolved further with guided missiles, nuclear-armed submarines, and new threats to carriers themselves. Yet Yamato's wreck remains on the ocean floor as a haunting monument to outdated naval thinking. Her silent guns and entombed crew embody both extraordinary courage and profound folly, a reminder of the immense human cost of war. The story of the Yamato and Operation Tengo reminds us that even the most powerful weapons ever created are ultimately only as effective as the strategy and doctrine guiding their use, and that no amount of personal courage or willingness to sacrifice can overcome fundamentally flawed strategic thinking. The young men of the Yamato deserve to be remembered and honored not merely as statistics in a failed military mission or as nameless casualties of a lost war, but as individual human beings who faced absolutely impossible odds with remarkable courage and dignity. Their story serves as a powerful reminder of the terrible human cost of war and the critical importance of questioning orders and strategies that serve national pride rather than legitimate military purpose. If you found this deep exploration of one of history's most tragic naval stories compelling and educational, please take just a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with anyone you know who's interested in naval history or World War II, and subscribe to our channel for many more detailed explorations of the ships, battles, and individuals that shaped our modern world.